Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Jane McGonigal. Here is her new book. It's called Imaginable: How to See the Future Coming and Feel Ready for Anything, Even Things That Seem Impossible Today. Well, I can think of half a dozen of those before breakfast. Jane McGonigal is a future forecaster and designer of reality games created to improve real lives and solve real problems. She's also the author of 2 New York Times best-selling books, Reality is Broken: Why Games Make Us Better and How They Can Change the World, and Super Better: The Power of Living Gamefully. And her 2 TED Talks on how gaming can improve our lives have over 15 million views. She's a professional game designer, and she also works for this Institute for the Future at Stanford University, and she teaches a course there on how to think like a futurist. And she also has a course on Coursera if you want to check it out. I'd start with the TED Talks after you listen to this podcast. Anyway, we discuss what's a futurist and when does the future begin? I mean, technically, the now is about 3 seconds. So I guess the future would be anytime 4 seconds from now into the future, and off it goes. And how do you think long term, 10 days, 10 years, 100 years, whatever? And so we discuss some of that. The word unimaginable, by definition, means you can't imagine it. So I press her on, what does it even mean to imagine the unimaginable or think the unthinkable? And to try to strike that right balance between being, so open to crazy new ideas that could happen in the future, that you believe every crazy thing, and being so closed off to being creative about the future that you fail to see anything. There has to be some balance there, so we discuss that. And then I press her on, what about COVID-19? Because she actually had a model she designed years before the COVID-19 breakdown that predicted pretty much everything that happened. So that's pretty interesting. But I'm also going to, just kind of talk to her about Russia and Ukraine and other things that futurists didn't anticipate. And then how to time travel in your own life, 10 days, 10 years from now. She has a whole section in the book on questions to ask yourself and little tasks and creative skills that you can learn to try to do this. In other words, you can't predict the future, but you can shape it in the way you want it to be. And that's what she has in mind with this book. So, hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jane McGonigal. This episode is brought to you by The Lost Debate. You ever feel like you're living in a media bubble? Like it's harder than ever to find views that challenge your own? I know I do. Well, that's where The Lost Debate steps in. It's a podcast and a YouTube show for political eclectics who crave exposure to a diversity of beliefs and perspectives, which is what I'm always looking for. The Lost Debate covers the latest news, ideas, and trends without the typical bias and manipulation you see in the mainstream media. Just think of MSNBC and CNN on one side and Fox News and the other conservative media on the other side, particularly conservative talk radio. This show tries to get around that by presenting multiple perspectives on current events. It's hosted by Ravi Gupta, a former staffer for Obama and a school principal who fought Republicans at the ballot box, then fought alongside them for charter schools. You can hear his conversation with me on this podcast, in which we talk about school reform, educational reform, and charter schools, and private schools, and public schools, and lots of other issues. He's a super interesting guy. Also hosting it is Corey Bradford, a progressive political organizer turned TikTok star. My old job. No, I don't think so. Who used to host a Fox News radio show. He's also an interesting person. And Ricky Schlott, a Gen Z New York Post columnist and libertarian fighting to protect free speech. So the three of them, Ravi, Corey, and Ricky, come from across the political aisle and from different generations, which makes a difference. But they come together for debates that sound less like crossfire and more like discussions between real people. So check it out. Go to The Lost Debate on whatever your favorite podcast platforms are, or obviously on YouTube as well and check it out. All right. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium. You've heard me talk about it before. It's my favorite platform for consuming content. And let me start off this particular one with a list of names to see if you've heard of these people. Augustine of Hippo, Ambrose Jerome and Gregory the Great, Boethius, Isidore of Seville, the Venerable Bede, Charlemagne and Alfred the Great, Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides, Rashi, Saladin, Hildegard of Bingen, Bernard of Clairvaux, Abelard and Eloise, Peter Lombard, Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, Geoffrey Chaucer, Francesco Petrarch, Lorenzo de Medici, Christine de Pizan, Sir Thomas Malory, and William Caxton in The Birth of Printing. These are a list of the names covered in this course from the Great Courses, Great Minds of the Medieval World. This is the course I'm going to take this coming week. I've heard of most of them, but not all of them, and I know next to nothing in detail about most of these characters, so I'm going to learn them. 24 lectures, 30 minutes a lecture. You can just pound through these things in a week if you're commuting or working out or just doing chores or whatever. It's a great way to go for it in terms of self-learning. So Wondrium has this offer through our podcast. For the $99 annual subscription fee, which is almost half off, you get a free subscription for the first trial period. So go to wondrium.com/Shermer to get the free trial if you sign up on the $99 annual subscription fee. And that gives you access to all the content, not just the great courses, but they have tons of great documentary series and other learning programs that they've adopted from other companies. It's really a great source of self-learning. So give it a shot. Again, go to wondrium.com/Shermer to get your free trial. All right. Thanks for listening. And here's our show. Jay McGonigal, here we go. The new book, Imaginable, How to See the Future Coming and Feel Ready for Anything, even things that seem impossible today. I can think of a lot of things. Right. So we were just saying, I think we met at TED 2010 in Long Beach. And I remember I was at your talk, being shocked about the number of millions of hours Americans spend on gaming. So that's pretty wild. But let's start with you just kind of giving us some background on who you are. What is your future past? How did you get to be a professional gamer and then a professional futurist? And where were you born and raised and went to school, and how'd you get interested in all this?
Well, I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in a suburb of Philadelphia. Both my parents were public school teachers, and so we were always learning. Weekends, summers. It was a family that really valued academia and research and learning, and so that was a great way to grow up. And I went to grad school where I wound up studying the psychology of games and how playing online games can change the types of problems we feel capable of solving in everyday life. But I didn't start down that path. I actually applied to grad school intending to study how scientists communicate research to the public through arts and theater and story. And I was thinking I might be in service of that for the rest of my life, helping scientists communicate research to the public. And in a way, I guess I am, although I also got more actively involved with doing scientific research and publishing research myself. But what weird things, happened to me at Berkeley when I started my PhD program was that I started to see people I played online games with develop an appetite for trying to use their gaming skills in service of something bigger than a virtual game, a virtual challenge. And they were looking for real world challenges like, can we investigate government corruption or solve missing persons cold cases? Or do any scientists have a bunch of data lying around they need creative help analyzing? And I thought it was really interesting, this passion, but I didn't know if it was realistic or kind of delusional. So I sort of shifted my interests and research attention to figuring out, what do games make us better at? What real skills do we develop, particularly in online and massively multiplayer games? And then is there anything we can apply that to that might contribute to humanity's long-term well-being? And for me, it turned out one of the most effective ways to apply gaming skills is forecasting the future. Although I would not have predicted that.
Your book is, yeah, that's right. Yeah, right. So it's not about the prediction so much as, anyway, your book is dedicated to Kelly McGonigal, who lives 6 minutes in the future. I take it you're a twin.
I am. Kelly's my identical twin, and she also got to grad school just 2 years ahead of me. She went to Stanford for psychology, but she really inspired me so she would sort of feed me new research and findings from the fields of psychology and neuroscience. And I would be like, oh, I'm sure that relates to gaming. So she was kind of like my superpower, doing her PhD just across the bay while I was doing mine in Berkeley.
What does she do now?
She writes books and gives TED Talks. I mean, I bet a lot of your listeners know her. Her TED Talk is, I think, one of the 5 or 10 most all-time viewed talks. It's on the upside of stress, or how to make stress your friend. So she does a lot of mind-body research and willpower and things like that. Yeah.
Right.
You should
guys
have her
any,
on the show.
Since we're on there, do you have any peculiar similarities? You know, you read about these twins that have, you know, they both snap rubber bands on their wrists, or they have the same kind of laugh, or they marry people that look the same, and that kind of thing.
I mean, we truly have lived very similar lives up to a point. We both met the man we would marry in the year 2000. And we're both with that same partner 22 years later. And they both have very similar temperaments. And we both went to get PhDs in the Bay Area, even though we grew up in New Jersey. We both started writing books and teaching and giving talks. And so, you know, our lives turned out very similar, even though if you were to hang out with us, you would say, oh my gosh, you're so different. She hates games. Oh, could not stand to play a game with you if you asked her. And I am not. She has like the empathy of a Buddha, you know, the Zen quality of a Buddha. And I'm a little more like,
Oh, that's really funny. Well, I'm very interested in human nature, and of course, the twins experiments are always a way to control for the genetic factor. Obviously, that plays a huge role. Although, since you're different on many specifics, like your whole life is dedicated to games, and she can't stand it, so it's always curious to know what particular life pathway bumped you down one way, and that was your passion, and it didn't happen for her. I mean, did you have like a mentor in college or somebody, or an experience that got you engaged in gaming and the rest of it?
Yeah, what a fun question. You know, she and I were both on the computer programming team in, I think it was 6th grade. So we were like 11 years old, and our middle school, they started a club where you could go to competitions, and they would give your team of 4 people a challenge to create a program. And so whatever programming language you knew, you'd have to write a program. And then at the end of the day, they would run all the programs and give awards for whoever had just, invented the best program. And I really liked that. And I think I got kind of hooked on that. And a lot of my early gaming experiences were actually making my own games on our Commodore 64 computer to date myself. And
that's funny.
Yeah, right. And she was more into like traditional artistic media. So she would paint and draw, and I would code.
Yeah, interesting. And I was just rewatching your TED Talk where you mentioned the 10,000 hour rule that Malcolm Gladwell made famous. It's not his rule about success. You got to put in the time, but obviously there's more than that. I know a lot of people criticize that book as I did. Because he used the Beatles as an example. They put in their 10,000 hours in those Hamburg dingy, places to practice their music, bars and whatever. And yet plenty of garage bands put in 10,000 hours and they still stink, right? So there has to be some other factors that work
Yes.
there. Not just raw skill. You and your sister are obviously both
Well,
intelligent and creative and all that, but what else goes into the formula?
but I mean, the original research that Malcolm based that book on talks about a particular kind of practice, right? Where you are working on the edge of your ability. It's not 10,000 hours doing something. It's 10,000 hours always at the edge of your ability, which is why I found it to be a fairly convincing uh, framework for thinking about gaming, because most gamers spend 80% of their time failing. They are in systems and worlds and challenges and levels where they aren't quite ready to be successful. And so they're always learning and experimenting and asking for help, and so they're on that edge. And I thought, well, if the original research about 10,000 hours, it was you have to be constantly pushing yourself to be developing further. And so gamers are really good at that. I mean, because they can live with that frustration because they enjoy the activity so much. They don't mind failing while they get better.
Yeah, if I follow your train of thought here from the gaming to the future, your new book, that we're running counterfactual experiments in our head, thought experiments, which are totally legitimate in science. I mean, Einstein famously developed his special and general theory of relativity by doing thought experiments, kind of playing games in his head of what it would be like to ride on a beam of light or fall down an elevator shaft that was bottomless alongside an object next to you, and they're both floating, that sort of thing. And so your work in futurism is not predicting the future, like when will Putin stop his war on Ukraine, or what will sanctions work or not, but rather kind of counterfactually playing games in your head about your personal life moving forward, just the rest of today, 10 days from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, and then changing the variables as you go to make it come out the way you were hoping it'll come out. Something like that?
Something like that. I usually teach those counterfactual skills early on in an imagination training workshop or course in service of a bigger type of game, which I describe as a social simulation. So it's not just that you're imagining what might be different, anything. I could just put anything in my mind and imagine it. I craft specific future scenarios and ask people what they would feel, how they would react and adapt, what they would need help with, what they would try to help others with. And most famously, in that 2010 TED Talk, I said, well, we just wrapped up a simulation game where we asked about 8,000 people what they would do in a respiratory pandemic. And we were just launching at that TED a game with the World Bank where we were going to look at a series of cascading crises, starting with a pandemic, but also moving on to a misinformation and conspiracy theory crisis where people were spreading theories and misinformation on social media. We talked about the compounding factors of historic wildfires due to climate change, supply chain disruptions. This was in 2010. The game was set in 2020 because we like to look 10 years ahead. And what we're asking people to do is to really vividly imagine, what if I woke up in this world? First of all, just so that if we do have to live through these types of challenges, we're not going to be frozen or unable to accept our new reality, right? We all have this normalcy bias with the real COVID-19 pandemic. People spent so long underplaying the risk, downplaying, is this really going to, okay, it's just in China. Okay, it's just in Italy. Okay, it's just in New York. Trying to prepare our minds to acknowledge reality as it changes. And one of the compelling areas of scientific research on futurist thinking is that once you vividly imagine something, you rate it as more likely or more plausible because you just have an easier time thinking about it. And we have this kind of built-in, bias towards things that are easy to picture, things that are easy to think about because we have so much information about them, because we have personal experience with them. They feel normal. They feel realistic. So we on one hand, I'm just inviting people to play with these ideas. So So we'll be ready, and we can kind of move on to actually dealing with it, living through it, helping.
You mean, so for example, what would I do if there was an earthquake at 3 a.m. and I got to take the family and get out because there's a fire or whatever? Having run through that in my head, then when I actually take the steps to do it, it'll be more effective. And essentially, I'm creating my own future in a way that's just more efficient because I've thought about it.
Yes, and that's something people, have experienced. They've done fire drills and, these basic things. What I try to help people simulate are disruptions or crises or threats they don't have enough information to imagine on their own. So a couple of topics that I'm running simulations on now at the Institute for the Future are how we're going to make decisions as a planet about geoengineering technology. If we decide we might need to try solar radiation management, put sulfate particles into the atmosphere to dim the sun for 10 years while we get off of carbon, fossil fuels, carbon emissions. We got to cool the planet while we're buying time to be fossil fuel free. How are we going to decide that we want to take the risk? How do we get informed consent of humanity? Are we going to just let one country say, you know what, we've got the tech, we're going to do it, thank us later? Or is there going to be global participation in deciding that? And so I don't think most people, like ordinary people on the street, have a lot of information about the options, the risks, the unexpected, consequences. If we're creating higher risk flood zones, is it going to affect food security if we sort of mess up and it takes us a few years to undo the consequences? I want people to start imagining this now, because if we wait 10 years to start this conversation, one, there might not be enough time to act. And two, it might be politicized. Like today, I don't think there's political, positions like Republicans are very pro geoengineering and people who consider themselves progressives hate it. Like, I don't think we have fixed party positions yet. So it's a really good time to talk about it from our values and our hopes and our fears before people are being told how to think based on tribal identities. So like an earthquake, simulation, but for things that you really can't imagine on your own, you need the help of a futurist, or you need the help of experts to really help you think through the opportunities and risks and consequences.
Yeah, those stories early in your book about you modeling what would happen if we had a pandemic 10 years before we had one. Looking back now, say on the last 2 years, we're starting our third year now. I think we got lucky with Omicron, but now last night I heard about the Deltacron. Maybe this could be worse, who knows. But how would you assess how we've done so far? United States or the globe, or pick whatever level you want to think about it.
Oh, I mean, we've definitely done way worse than we should have. The reason why I called my book Imaginable is I was starting to get frustrated after, especially, towards the end of 2020, people were saying, well, nobody could have predicted that mask wearing would be so contentious, or that so many people would resist quarantine. Why are they going to church when they just got a positive test? People are saying this is unpredictable, unimaginable, unthinkable. But in fact, when news started first coming out of Wuhan in late January, we held a public webinar at the Institute for the Future, sharing out some of what we saw in the data from our earlier simulations. Specifically, my favorite question to ask people when we were running these simulations was, imagine you've been told to isolate for 2 weeks. Under what circumstances do you just go out anyway? Like, do you break quarantine or break isolation? The number one thing people said was for religious worship, that it was so core to their values and their community identity, they would go anyway. People said for weddings and funerals were the next two. And those did turn out to be the super spreader events. We asked people about, will you be able to not go to work if you need to isolate or work from home? And we heard from women who had young children that they were concerned, well, if schools are shut down, am I going to be able to work? Am I going to be expected to do the caretaking? And of course, we saw in 2020 the historic exodus of women from the workforce to do caretaking. I mean, a lot of things that people said were hard to predict, people very accurately predicted just by thinking about what they would need or want. Mask wearing was another thing. We actually asked people to try wearing masks. Go into your normal social situations, go on public transportation, walk around town with a mask on. How does it feel? How long could you wear a mask for? Are you okay with it? Does it interfere with any of your activities? And based on what we heard then, we knew that in communities where there was not a history of mask wearing, it was going to be a nightmare to get people to actually do this seemingly easy, rational action. So, what I'm excited about going forward is, surely with climate change, climate migration, the next pandemic might be tick-borne. We're going to be doing geoengineering. There's so much stuff that we haven't lived through yet as a species. But if we ask people to imagine it, we can get useful, actionable data that will help us not be so shocked, by what people actually do, the social side of these crises.
Right. So give us some sense of what you do at the Institute for the Future. What is it? How do they get customers? How do they fund themselves? I mean, do big corporations or government organizations like the CDC come to you and say, for the next pandemic, we want to make sure we do the right thing. So what should we do? And then you run some of these experiments or whatever.
Yes. So some of my projects have been funded by foundations in the past. So there was a foundation that was interested in coming up with new ways of learning in the future so that people who needed to be reskilled or upskilled as their jobs were automated, what new ways might they get new skills in the future? And so, I created a scenario looking at how blockchain technologies might be incorporated into a new learning system, right? So we do develop scenarios for specific topics and foundations, but the work that I'm doing now is we're looking for grants because really there are certain topics that we need to simulate, like climate migration, and so we're just starting that work now. We just opened a new online public social simulation center that anybody who's interested in participating in these games can come and join. It's called Urgent Optimists. And we teach you how to play and we help you learn the skills of futurists, actually, so you can create your own scenarios if you want. And right now, this work, we do get grants and donations, but, if anybody's out there with wants to make a big endowment for the future of humanity, I could definitely use some support for this work because it's not, it's not a monetized activity. People have not, paid to play these games. They're volunteers and they freely donate their time and imagination, and you have to be creative.
Since we're in the middle of the Ukraine war with Russia's war in Ukraine, I should say. Have you guys done any geopolitical type experiments to, I don't know, predict what countries should do, where, when, like what U.S. foreign policy, who should we fund, where should we intervene or not? Who should we support or not? Those sorts of questions.
Yeah, not quite that line of questioning, but there was a project a few years ago that I came back to in writing this book when I was looking for examples of really serious challenges turning to these types of games for ideas, because I really wanted to, let people know there's like nothing too serious to play a game with. We don't have to worry that, well, this is not, appropriate to play games with pandemics or whatever it might be. And there was a researcher at the Institute for the Future, so I wasn't involved with this project, but a researcher, a well-known futurist named Jaime Cascio, he worked with a group that wanted to come up with really strange, novel frameworks for imagining nuclear disarmament and how it might happen faster. And there's actually there's a lot of frustration in that community that there are certain assumptions that go unquestioned, and they were looking for scenarios that challenge the basic assumptions of the nuclear security community. One is that the only players are essentially, heads of state. This is a geopolitical process that hardly anyone on the planet has any active role in, right? The assumption that it's going to be slow and like incremental. There's no big, exponential win. It's going to just be, just keep like sort of clawing away at it one, device at a time. And one of the scenarios they came up with that I think would have seemed totally absurd before the pandemic, but revisiting it a few years later, I thought, this doesn't sound so impossible. One of the ideas was that there might be a private company that developed essentially a miracle technology that they would withhold and only make available to nations that agree to disarm. And so thinking about, the vaccines, what if there were a deadlier version of COVID-19 and there were a private, vaccine manufacturer like there is for COVID-19, but they withheld that technology to countries unless they disarmed. So you could imagine that for a geoengineering technology as well. Could we sort of take this out of the geopolitical negotiations, like slow, incremental, and just force people? Because honestly, it's insane that we still live under the nuclear threat that we live in, that we've just sort of dropped the ball on looking for real transformative change in that space. So I think there are certainly scenarios and research out there using these types of playful games that look at the geopolitical issues as well.
Yeah. I've written a fair amount about applying game theory to nuclear disarmament. And I just don't see the way around the problem of what's called the Hobbesian trap or the security dilemma or the other guy problem. We'll give ours up, but what if the other guy doesn't? And I don't want to use them, but the other guy might, and he's thinking the same thing, right?
Yep.
And, you get this, that I'm going to hang on to this one last one just in case. Because we know not everybody's good. Not everybody has deep empathy, as you call it. Putin probably being one of them. And, would any of this be unfolding the way it is in Ukraine if Putin didn't have the nuclear sword dangling over all of our heads? I mean, we could just put an end to it immediately with, just implement the no-fly zone, shoot down all their jets. The reason we don't do it is because it could escalate in conflict with NATO. And then, you start using tactical nuclear weapons, and before you know it, you have global thermonuclear war. We can't do that. So, you end up saying, well, we can't shoot down the bad planes, and because this could happen, and he knows that, and he knows we know that, and he knows that we know that he knows that, and I don't know, I don't know the way around that.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think this scenario is in some ways appealing, because it can address that by imagining that there's some risk worse than you not having a nuclear bomb and the other guy having it. If there's some danger, some degree of climate change or some novel virus that is here and it's not a hypothetical threat, it sounds ludicrous, right? But what people are doing now is at least thinking through the framework of, let's say you did have a miracle technology. How would you use that as leverage? I mean, let's at least have a tactical plan in case this opportunity arises. How would you follow through? How would you attempt to do this? One big, fire sale, nuclear weapons. Everybody's all going out of a sale, and we're going to do it together. And let's have a plan. So I don't know. And maybe in coming up with these ridiculous ideas, the nuclear security community will come upon something more practical and more actionable today. I think it's always good to give ourselves, I guess like enough psychological distance from what we might try today or what we might think is possible today, so that we can be more creative and freer in what we're suggesting and not sort of foreclose prematurely on possibilities. So we imagine something, weird happening in 10 years. Maybe some of that trickles back to today where we can, really tune it into something a little more practical or actionable.
Yeah, you're probably familiar with Cass Sunstein and Dick Thaler's work on nudge, or so-called libertarian paternalism or choice architecture. Sounds like that's a lot of along the lines of what you're doing. Just kind of project out what is it that nudges people to do this thing or that thing, to go this way or that way, to choose this food or that food. And we can kind of tune the incentives in a kind of a behavioral economic model.
Well, absolutely, in the sense that we're trying to create incentives to think about long-term problems when the brain is much more in favor of thinking about things that are salient today right in front of us, right? Like literally we just don't get enough of a dopamine hit from taking actions that might pay off in 10 years. Our brain wants all the good stuff now. So how do we encourage people to take actions that have a long-term benefit? It turns out that vividly imagining the world you might live in 10 years from now, or even what it will feel like to be in your body. And that gets at some of the more foundational imagination exercises we were talking about. Even just to physically imagine my body 10 years from now, 10 years older, what it might feel like, but maybe I'll have more energy because my 7-year-old kids will be going off to college. So I'll be like a free woman, empty nest. Maybe it won't be so bad to be 10 years older. You start to put yourself in your body and in the context of the future. Then we actually do become more likely to take actions that have long-term benefits. We're more likely to vote because voting is like, you have to take time and energy today, even though if the person wins, they don't take office right away, and then it takes forever to them pass legislation, and then it takes longer for it to go into effect. That's something with a long-term payoff that people are more likely to do when they are connected with their future selves, eating healthier, exercising, saving money for long-term goals or retirement, being in favor of climate action. These are all things that the more vividly we imagine the far future, the more likely we are to do. And so to that extent, there's definitely, some of that same psychology. We're trying to trick the brain into caring about further out in time than just, tomorrow or next month or next year.
They're like Tversky and Kahneman's availability heuristic. You ask people what they're afraid of, and it's whatever was on the news last night: shark attacks, terrorist attacks, killer bees, or whatever. Yeah. And not prostate cancer, breast cancer, heart, cardiovascular disease, asthma, whatever. So in a way you're saying, okay, picture yourself, because isn't it something like 70% of Americans don't have any money for retirement? When they retire, they don't have any savings. But if you're 25 or 30 years old,
because it literally feels,
it's like, I'm not even thinking about that.
No, why would you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a researcher at UCLA who did fMRI studies of people imagining themselves at retirement age. And the younger you are, so the further away from retirement age you are, the more your brain essentially treats future you as a stranger. So the part of the brain that is very fired up when it's salient to you, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, it doesn't power up for old you, right? For future you. And so, they wrote in a paper that putting away money for retirement is like handing money to a stranger on the street. Why would you do that? You're never even going to see this person. You don't know this person. But there are ways to develop empathy for your future self and connect with your future self. And they developed VR systems, which is, an interesting way of using gaming technology where they can age you. And so that you can, even the physicality of it, or they can show you avatars where you're aged and try to help you connect in that way. For me, I just ask people to imagine, like use the VR in your own mind, right? We all have this amazing simulator in our heads to do that.
Yeah, I love that whole discounting the future research and the marshmallow test and all that stuff. But so it's good to plan for the future. But on the other hand, what good would it be to save up for the best 90th birthday anyone ever had and I keel over dead at 89? Maybe I should spend some of it now. I mean, this is always the problem, right? When do you start,
Yeah.
kind of enjoying yourself? I'm in this stage right now. I'm 67,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm kind of betting with the government about when I'm going to die. So I'm not collecting Social Security
Mm-hmm.
yet. I'm going to wait till, maybe 70, 71. But of course, the government, whoever they are, they're hoping I keel over dead soon so they don't have to spend the money. And it's kind of a race to that. And so all of life is this kind of a marshmallow test, right? We're always trying to decide, should I
Mm-hmm.
spend it now because I want not just haphazardly just to have fun, but that you have to,
Mm-hmm.
live life now just in case, who knows what tomorrow brings.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And, just because I'm a professional futurist does not mean that I think we should defer all pleasure or, do everything for the future and forget about living for today. My work is really more about assuming that there is a future us, and we want future us to be able to be happy and healthy. And it maybe that means eating healthier, but maybe that means taking climate action, or it means educating ourselves about solar radiation management so that we can vote yes on the sun exit, election, the first global election, where we all vote on something for humanity. But yeah, so, we don't have to defer pleasure to the future, but we should be able to acknowledge that when I wake up 10 years from now, it's still me. It's still me. And I don't want to wake up in a world that I have not intentionally tried to shape, for the better with my actions.
I was just writing about the abortion issue and pro-choice and pro-life, and that the problem isn't abortions, it's unwanted pregnancies. And then I found this study in which it was like on 7,500 young women, and some 2 or 3% said that they got pregnant without sex. So who were these immaculate conceiving Marys? Well, they were teenagers who had taken an abstinence pledge, and they also reported that their parents
Oh.
were uncomfortable talking to them about sex and birth control. So essentially, their current self gladly signed the abstinence pledge. Oh, sure, of course, I'm just not going to have sex. But then, the future self is in a situation which,
Yeah.
things happen in the passion of the moment and you're unprepared. Boom, they get pregnant. That seems a striking example of that, discounting the future and having a hard time picturing your future self. And you better be prepared for future self being weaker in will than current self. And same thing with diets or, pick any, I think it it said I can resist anything except temptations or something like that. I think anyway.
Well, there, I'm sure you're familiar with the phenomenon in social psychology called the end of history illusion, which is that most people tend to assume that 10 years in the future, they will still have the same likes and dislikes, the same values, the same habits, the same relationships. But when they look back 10 years, they would describe their current likes and dislikes and values and habits and relationships as being very different from 10 years ago. But for some reason, we assume that we have essentially reached our fullest, truest version of ourselves and our lives in the present moment. And so we downplay the possibility of change even in ourselves, let alone the world around us. I mean, the end of history illusion, it refers, to the economy, to geopolitics. We'd sort of be like, oh, okay, this is how things are now. And one of the habits we practice at the Institute for the Future is look back to look forward. Just constantly remind yourself, if you're thinking about the future of food, look back 10 years, look back 20 years, how much has changed that would have surprised us, 20 years ago, that's true today. So, but we have that same illusion about our own personalities and lives and values. So that also can make it hard to predict the future. But even if we have different likes and values and habits, I'm sure we all want to wake up on a planet that is, not suffering from extreme heat and droughts and fires and pandemics. I mean, I try to focus on the stuff that will universally affect us, and no matter who we are in 10 years, we're still going to want to be able to adapt and survive and help ourselves and others.
Yeah,
it's a constant balance between the unpredictable and the
right. I mean, I just when I'm reading your book and all these questions you ask, like what do you picture your life in 10 years? Beats me. I don't know. I didn't know 10 years ago what I'd be doing now. I mean, I'm 67. When I was 57, I had just recently gotten divorced. I have an adult daughter. And I thought, well, that's it. I'm done. I guess I'm just gonna be a single guy. Maybe I'll get remarried. Who knows? But I'm done with parenthood. And then now I have a 5-year-old. It's like, okay, so I met a woman, we fell in love, and she had never been married or had kids. And she's, I want to have a baby with you. I'm like, okay. And then it's like, oh, wow, this is totally different than
love that.
what I thought was going to happen. And it's great. So, I mean, how would anybody predict that, or just more practical things like, that I have a podcast, I have a Substack column, I wouldn't even know what that is 10 years ago. I missed the whole window of blogging, podcasting, all that stuff because I'm older, so I'm used to older media. I had a column in Scientific American. I would write op-eds for the New York Times, LA Times, Wall Street Journal. To me, that was like, that's the media. And I really missed the early stages of blogging, podcasting, and all that. And, now it's like, well, what's the next thing? I have no idea. Who knows what?
You need an NFT, Michael. That's we need NFT, Skeptic NFTs. Well, it's funny that like, how could you have predicted that you would wake up and be a father again and these things? One thing that we see when people imagine their lives 10 years from now, and I try to make it very specific, because if you just ask people 10 years, it's like too hard. So I say, well, you're waking up. Imagine you are just in that moment of waking up. Like, where are you? Are you in a bed? Where is that bed? Where is that room? If you're not in a bed, are you waking up on a plane? Where's the plane going to? Who's next to you? What time zone are you in? What wakes you up? Is it an alarm, a call? What are they calling you about? And you start to fill in these details. And it turns out most people fill them with ideas that are very closely linked to their deepest values and hopes. That when we think 10 years out, we're liberated from, the mundane details. Like, tomorrow I have a whole to-do list and a lot of it's stuff I don't want to do. And their expectations. But when we go 10 years out, nobody's telling us what to do yet, right? Nothing's on our Google Calendar yet. So people's minds tend to go towards ideas or things that are very, very deeply meaningful. And so you might not think of this exercise as being a good way to predict the future, but it might be a good way to start a conversation with yourself about, how do you want to use this next decade so that you are more likely to wake up in a space, in a place, in a moment that you would look forward to, right? And so we use it it can also be a tool for personal exploration. It's not just all about, get ready for the crazy stuff. It's also use the luxury of time spaciousness to let yourself imagine, because we can't change our lives by tomorrow, in a really meaningful way, but we could make some big changes in a decade.
So the people you do this research with, or I should say the subjects that are taking these tests, what are some of these deeper things that they say that they want in 10 years that are like life meaningful?
Oh, well, I mean, I'll tell you my experience. So, anytime we run a simulation, and so again, usually I'm not just doing these abstractly with people. It'll be like, okay, we're going to simulate the first tick-borne pandemic, and it's making people allergic to meat. Right? Okay. Which is a real potential public health crisis that people are thinking about and getting ready for. So I'll be like, okay, in fact, I just started a simulation on that today. That's why it's sort of front in mind. Right before this conversation, I was leading people through the scenario. And Before we go to this future, though, I do ask people to imagine who they might be in 10 years so that when they say, okay, well, here's the choices I'm making, like the tough decisions or the actions I'm taking. Again, remember, this is 10 years in the future. So you have to first change your idea of who you are, who you might be. If you're a college student today, you'll probably have a job 10 years from now, right? So when I first started doing these games, I always play my own games because I want to get the same, benefits of participating. And
Mhm.
I was filling out my little future profile, and I had just gotten married. My husband and I were very much not going to have kids. That was part of the agreement conversation. And I'm creating my profile for this game where we're going to think about a pandemic and we're going to think about supply chain crises and all of we called it virtual currencies back then, but we were essentially playing with cryptocurrencies. And I was like, I feel like in this future, I have a daughter, because I suddenly I couldn't imagine what my husband and what is motivating us, what is making us brave in this world, or what makes us really want to fix things, like that fire in our souls. I was like, I think I have a daughter in this future, and I'm like just typing even against like my conscious mind. I'm like, I live with my husband and our 7-year-old daughter Pepper. And what was I had never really thought I wanted to be a mom. And this was a game, again, about serious stuff. This was not simulate Jane McGonigal's future. This was like a serious crisis simulation. But I had this thought, and it turned out to be very fortunate that I had this thought then, because it took almost 10 years for us to actually start a family. It did not turn out to be easy physically, financially, a lot of science and technology and help involved. And so I always look back at that and think, of all the things that we learned about pandemics and global crises in that game, I learned that I wanted to be a mom. And if I hadn't like had that active imagination, I probably would have run out of time if I hadn't thought of that so early in my own life. So yeah.
Are there
But my
decadal?
husband would not let me name our daughter Pepper,
Oh,
as it turned
oh,
out.
oh, oh, really?
I was like, really? Can we? Not even as a middle name,
But I wrote
Peppermint.
it down 10 years ago. Come on, we have to use that name. That's really funny.
Yeah.
So would there be
Talk me out of it.
decadal or age cohort differences in predicting the future? Like if you ask a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old or 40-year-old, clearly they got to have different,
Yeah. So 2 big differences. So a few years ago, I conducted the largest national survey of futures thinking that I think has been conducted for the Institute. Conducted anywhere. I conducted it for the Institute. And we saw a couple really interesting things. So one is when you're younger, you have a really hard time imagining anything further out than you have a memory of. So let's say you're like 20, so you can remember like back about 10, 15 years at most. If I ask you to imagine 20 years out, it is virtually impossible. It's like we can't imagine on timelines that we haven't lived through. So if you're 40, well, you could imagine, I've asked you to imagine 30, 35 years in the future, you would be more comfortable with it because you have a lived experience, right? Of how events change, how history unfolds, how your own life can change. So that's interesting. So it actually is quite hard for young people because they don't have a lived experience of life unfolding at that scale. But the other thing is people who get older really are less actively involved as they age in thinking about far futures. So something like, I want to say 10% of people over 65 say they regularly imagine what the world might be like in 10 years or what they might be like, what they might be doing in 10 years. And the number one reason why is that people, they say either it's unpleasant to imagine because as we age, many of us experience a physical decline or mental decline or loss of loved ones. So if we imagine the future as being painful, we don't want to think about it. Or we think, well, I'm not going to be around for it. So it's just not really something I need to actively give my attention to. And that has consequences also. I mean, it affects how people vote. It affects how people participate in society, what advice they give to their younger family members. So, even when I teach at Stanford's continuing studies program, I often will have people who are retired, and they start the class and they're like, wait, we're going to be talking about 10, 20 years in the future. I need to know. To me, the future is like 2 years from now. What do I invest in? I'm like, nope, we're going to go on a journey and we're going to make, the year 2035 feel meaningful to you, even if it's not something you think a lot about now.
Yeah, in his new book Rationality, Steven Pinker has a thought experiment on talking about the negativity bias. Think of all the ways that your life could go bad today, and then think of all the ways your life could go good today. And his point is that we can think of lots of ways for things to go bad, because there are a lot of ways for things to go bad pretty quickly. I get in a car accident, or I fall off a cliff on a hike, or get hit on my bike, or whatever. But good things, it's more gradual. Like, I don't know, I made, like 0.5% in the stock market today, or my wife told me she loves me again, and my dog and I went for a walk and it was nice. It's just kind of little tiny things that just incrementally. Do you find any those kind of differences in your research on people predicting what their future lives might be like?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so another type of game that I've worked on that is not future forecasting is I created a game called Super Better when I had a mild traumatic brain injury that I had a hard time recovering from. And I was, at the time, this was like 2009, even less was known about what causes lingering effects from a concussion. And there were really, the only treatment was rest. Just keep resting till you feel better. And if you don't feel better, then this is just how your brain is now. So you have to learn and adapt. And so I was just like looking for habits or practices that I could basically build a life around. And one of the habits that I was trying to build was keeping a list of things, plausibly good things that could happen. Like, if I wake up tomorrow, what do I possibly have to look forward to? And if there's nothing on my list, what can I create to look forward to? And that actually turned out to be, eventually the game became an app, and we had over 1 million people use it, and different children's hospitals and university medical centers ran randomized controlled study, clinical trial. That future looking aspect of the Super Better game turned out to be really important because we now know, we did not know as much in 2009, is that during concussion recovery, the brain actually has much more difficulty imagining the future in vivid detail. So descriptions of the future tend to be very vague. Or if you were to ask somebody, like, describe what you plan to do this weekend, they might just simply say, like, I have no idea. That's too far away. I'm not sure. Or they would say very vague answers. Whereas somebody without a brain injury could come up with lots of details. Well, when I wake up, I'll probably do this, and then I'll walk my dog, and I might see my friend, and I'll be wearing this. Very vivid details. And there's something about the absence of details that when we can't imagine the future vividly, we feel depressed, right? Because we're motivated by the future, even if it's the near future, even if it's 5 minutes from now, right? Our motivation comes from anticipating that something good could happen as a result of our own efforts or attention or somebody else. So yeah, I think about that a lot when I do the social simulations now. I want people, when they imagine, a world in which 1 billion people are migrating due to extreme heat or drought. I mean, that sounds like a terrible world, but I do want people to imagine good things happening in that world also. So if we live at higher density than we've ever lived before, right? Like it could be a flourishing, a renaissance for urban centers. Like, what does city life look like if we move 1 billion people into areas where maybe we haven't lived in that kind of density before? What new culture, innovation, economies? I mean, it could be great. Let's imagine a world in which having to move still provides opportunities for things to look forward to. So I do try to bring that psychology in still.
In addition to age differences, are there generational differences in predicting people predicting their future lives? Like baby boomers like me are different from Gen Xers, are different from millennials, are different from now iGen. There's much talk now about how iGeners are very different. So-called Gen Z. They're less likely to get married, return to living with their parents. They have less sex. They drink less.
Yes.
Some things are good. Some things are not good. I don't know. It's hard to say, but is that a real effect? And is that always the case? Because doesn't every generation think, boy, art like Future Shock? You talked about Future Shock, Alvin Toffler's book. We live in this really special time, but doesn't everybody think they live in a really special time? And so there's kind of a generational effect there.
Well, that is true. I mean, I would say this generation, if we look at younger people, so like ages 16 to 25, there was a landmark study published in Lancet Planetary Health Journal just last month, largest study of its kind, talking to 10,000 people, young people aged 16 to 25 from all over the world, like every continent except Antarctica. They found that 56% of people in this demographic say that they believe humanity is doomed. That's a direct quote. Humanity is doomed. They agreed with that statement. And they personally have no future. And when asked to provide reasons for this, the number one reason was confusion and anger over the failure of government to take significant action on climate change. And I mean, I do have to say the level of future despair and anxiety, I mean, you may be right that we all, like when I was growing up as a child and teenager, we worried more about nuclear war than, many decades after. And it did feel like we were living in the end times in a way. And so maybe every generation has its own unique apocalyptic, fear or dread that it lives with. But according to the researchers, this is the highest level of negative affect about the future that has been documented. And this has been replicated in other studies. In general, more people express more fear or worry about the future than hope or optimism than we have seen in the past. So I don't know that I don't know if it's generational or just factual, like maybe humanity is like more on the edge than we have been before. But certainly those young people today, I do think they are uniquely in need of some support in either, first imagining a future that they can be confident and believe in, and then, all of us taking the right actions so that their worst fears are not experienced.
But to me, this is kind of the problem with doomsdayism and the environmental movement. At some point, it may make people feel like, well, what's the point? Why bother to even try? We're all screwed. I mean, it says right there, there's these books saying it's too late. We're doomed. And so what can I do? I'm just, one little person. And so as opposed to
one little person can't.
No, we all have to do it.
I mean,
but one of my criticisms of the environmental movement is you should take more credit for everything that's been done since the 70s. I mean, look how much better air quality is and water quality in most cities. I'm in LA. Oh my God, it was terrible back in the 70s and 80s. You couldn't go outside after like 10 or 11 in the morning. Smog was so bad. And that all the credit for that goes to the environmental movement. Same thing with the ozone hole. The environmental movement gets credit for all that, and overpopulation. Yeah. Figuring out what needs to be done to get people to have fewer babies and so on. The environmental movement should get some credit for that. So instead of the doomsdayism, I'd rather have a narrative for the future that, look, we can solve this problem. Geoengineering, just all electric cars. I call it the Elon Musk model. Look, even to conservatives, look, you can become a billionaire by saving the planet, right? And
I mean, there are some great thinkers right now working on that. Saul Griffith has a great new book called Electrify, where he tries to lay out a vision of climate action that is awesome. Don't you want to wake up in this world where everything is electrified through clean energy and we still have a bunch? No, you don't have to drive less. You don't have to because it's all, clean energy. So he's trying to create a positive vision of the climate future. Derek Thompson has a great new framework. He calls it the abundance agenda, where he thinks exactly as you've articulated it, we need to stop only talking about climate change as this apocalyptic future we're going to wake up in, but actually say, hey, if we start to address it, things are going to be cheaper and cleaner and beautiful and more equitable, or all the things we want the future to be. So his work is good there. And then, at the end of my book, Imaginable, the 3 big scenarios that I ask people to play with are all stories about really strong, concerted global effort to make things better. And the climate migration scenario, I'm asking people to imagine a world where we can move more freely than we do today. And a lot of people actually think that sounds like a positive future, and we might have to arrive at it with a kick in the pants from climate change. But, 150 years ago, the immigration laws and borders and all this stuff this is not a historical fact going back thousands of years, right? It's only recently that we decided that you should be, that where you are born is a lifelong fate, that you have no control over that destiny. And I too, I strive to create worlds, futures that do have appeal and can be a positive story, but I don't think we get to them, unless we are willing to maybe live through some turbulent times, social turbulence, like the hard work of making tough choices, or getting people on board with extreme action. It's not going to be all fun and easy, but I do think we can wake up in amazing futures.
Well, I have a hard out today, as I mentioned to you. So let's wrap up with kind of a personal look at predicting your own future. I was reading your book, I was thinking about Roy Baumeister's research on the difference between happiness and purposefulness. And, we all want to be happy, but we also want to live meaningful, purposeful lives. And they aren't necessarily the same thing, right? That like happiness is more short term. I'm going to have going out with friends tonight. That'll be fun. Play with my kid tomorrow, go for a bike ride, whatever. Okay. Yeah. But, in 10 years from now, that's meaningless, but like caretaking for my parents, which I had to do, it was not fun. I didn't make me happy doing it, but I felt like a better person for it, kind of more of a long-term thing. Anyway, so just kind of reflect on that for what people can get out of how to think about the future between happiness and meaningfulness.
Well, one of the things I ask people to do before we simulate any future is to make a list of the values that really are their core values. And so that could be, love of learning. I learn something new every day. It could be to appreciate beauty in the world wherever I see it. It could be being the best parent I could be, or standing up for what's right, or spreading truth and freedom of information. Whatever drives us, we identify that. And then when we go to these future worlds, I ask people, how will you live that value in a pandemic, or in an energy crisis, or during a period of mass migration? How will you act in service of that? How will you continue to live according to that thing that gives you the most meaning and purpose? And that really changes people's narratives. It's not about, I'm going to buy toilet paper, or I'm going to stock up on, pasta or beans. Like, it becomes much more, the stories they tell about what they might do in the future becomes much more meaningful. And so I love that you asked that question. And I do think when we imagine our best futures or the crisis futures, that we should be driven by our values and the things that lead us to a meaningful life, not just a happy one.
Yeah. Reminds me of that story that's possibly apocryphal, but of JFK touring one of the NASA facilities and asking one of the underlings, just standing there, what do you do here? And he says, we're working to put a man on the moon. That's what I'm doing. Like, oh, yeah, okay. So, it doesn't matter what your little job is. We have this bigger goal, this mission we're all working toward. So, yeah, that's great. All right, Jane McGonigal, loved your book, love your work. Thanks for coming on the show. Sorry I have to cut it off just a little earlier, but I know you have lots of things to do as well. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This is really fun.